Hello and welcome on into this week's episode of Digging Deeper. I'm Matt Cordy, joined here today by a man who wishes he was a little bit taller, wishes he was a baller, maybe have a 6'4" Impala. We'll skip over a couple lines there, but good to have Pastor Marcus here with us today.
Oh man, I greatly appreciate the reference. I was thinking about how I could incorporate that into
I knew you
into
were
the message.
I knew
but, it. But it feels good to be seen. I'll just say that.
I think you're all of those things now. I mean,
thanks.
I don't know if you have a hat with a rabbit and a bat, or I don't know. But
there you go. No rabbits in our house currently.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and you can call Vanessa whenever you want to. So
that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that was just your middle school self, or whenever that song came out. It's probably middle school for you, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I don't know the
95?
year on that one. Yeah, so that'd be elementary school still, right?
Okay.
So I was born in '89.
You were wishing you were taller back then.
Yeah.
So.
For sure.
Hit you deep.
That's right.
Yeah, but we won't have to dig into Pastor Marcus's height any more than we already have. But we're gonna get going into this sermon, which I thought was a fun one, talking about the ruler. And there's definitely some similarities between the ruler and the scale.
For sure.
But I think it's interesting to dig into just how this can clutter up the junk drawer of our spirituality. And interested to get into this and how you sort of broke down the foolishness and the curse of the ruler, and then the freedom that comes along with that.
Yeah.
And then sort of on the back end, I think we'll talk about that optional chapter, which talked about the why of work.
Yeah.
And sort of goes into the freedom from that ruler.
Right.
Where what is the why of our work and how can we live in that freedom?
And I think one of the things that we kind of see, like in the way that he unpacks the chapter, is in some ways, I think work can very easily be one of those places, even though he has this kind of own metaphor, for the junk drawer with the ID badge, that I think in some ways we could almost think about like that sort of misappropriation of our work as sort of a manifestation of both the scale and the ruler, right? That's one of those things that we try to measure to look to for our goodness or our worth and things like that. But we'll save that for the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get started here at the beginning where you talked about that foolishness of the ruler, starting with the first 6 verses of Galatians 3. And you have a quote here from our good old pal Martin Luther that you wanted to
Marty's
fit
back.
in.
Marty's
That's right.
back. Yeah. So this is from Luther's Lectures on Galatians. Is often kind of heralded as sort of one of Luther's best, if not the best, sort of theological work that he wrote. In fact, it's like so highly regarded that if you read the Formula of Concord, in the articles where it talks about justification, it talks about a couple of like issues that were present there during that period of time when the Formula of Concord was written. But it basically just concludes by saying, and this a paraphrase, but saying like, that's all we have to say. If you want more thorough exposition, just go read Luther's Galatians commentary, because that's where it's dealt with the best, right? And so in some ways, it's sort of, it's an important work for Lutherans, because the writers of the Formula of Concord in the Lutheran Confessions almost kind of give it this sort of pseudo-confessional status by saying like, hey, here's like, we're dealing with some specific issues relating to justification that have arisen kind of after the early days of the Reformation. But if you want the most thorough way of dealing with this, like Luther's commentary on Galatians, that's where it's dealt with the best. That's where it's dealt with most thoroughly. And so there's a lot of interesting kind of themes, that come out of there. And then just a lot of just interesting things that Luther attends to in Paul's letter to the Galatians. So would just like, that's like, probably like Luther at its best, at his best. Lectures on Galatians, like that's the one.
It's a fun book. You get Paul sort of a little feisty in there.
Well, it's a very, right.
Yeah.
And not only that, it's a very foundational book of the Bible for, the founding of the Lutheran Church, and for a lot of the themes regarding justification that arose during the time of the Reformation. And so Romans, kind of the book that sort of sparked Luther's theology, but it's his reflection on Galatians that's really where he kind of refines his theology. And so from there, Luther commenting on this passage, particularly Paul's language of the who has bewitched you, O Galatians. I just think Luther really kind of captures the spirit of what Paul's driving at here in this portion when he says, this bewitchment then is nothing other than a dementing by the devil, who inserts into the heart a false opinion, one that is opposed to Christ. A bewitched person is one who is taken captive by this opinion. Thus, those who are persuaded that they are justified by works of the law or by works of human tradition are bewitched, for this persuasion is directly contrary to faith and to Christ. Paul uses this odious term, bewitch, as an expression of contempt and spite against the false apostles who are arguing that the doctrine of the law and its works with such vehemence. It is as though he were saying, alas, what a satanic bewitchment this is, for the mind is corrupted by spiritual witchcraft as the senses are by the physical sort. And I just love that, like what Luther's really driving at here is, right, he's like these false opinions, right, that Paul is calling a sort of bewitchment, are really ultimately, like, what do they boil down to? They boil down to that they're opposed to Christ, right? They're causing people to lean on, to rely on something other than Christ, right? And so when we think of which is, I think, interesting, because a lot of times when we think of like the work of Satan, the work of the devil, we maybe tend to, and not necessarily wrongly, we think of, things like witchcraft, the occult, or we think of things like sin and temptation and, that enticement to do evil things, which again, certainly is, right, the work of the enemy, right? We pray in the Lord's Prayer, right? Lead us not into temptation, right? We're asking for that rescue from evil in that sense. But I think what Luther captures here from Galatians 3 is that Paul is driving at anything that's opposed to Christ, right? Anything that would cause us to lean on something other than faith in Jesus for our security before God is a bewitchment, right? And so even, just like that leaning on, right, that again, this is where we're getting at, like the foolishness of the ruler, right? Measuring what I've done, right? And saying, well, because I've given this amount, or because I've served this amount, or because I've done these good works, or because I don't engage in all of this kind of bad behavior, that's how I know I'm a Christian. That's how I know that I'm close to God. Like Paul and Luther here with him would say, like, that is a form of bewitchment. It is the enemy that entices us to trust in those things rather than in Jesus.
And it's something that we would, want to write off as like harmless, or like, oh, it's not hurting anything.
Yeah.
But I think they do a good job of like calling out the severity of like the harms that
come. Yeah. And again, I don't want to say that at the expense of those other things, right? That sometimes, right, like Satan is, he's crafty, right? And is going to use what he can to draw us away from Jesus. Sometimes that may mean, being led into temptation and enticed into sin, and that being the thing that leads me to believe, you know what, like, I don't really need to follow Jesus. Other times, right, it is that leading, us to rely on ourselves rather than in Christ. That we can be tempted by the enemy, both through being really, really bad and through actually being really, really good. And here Paul is addressing the temptation of relying on the fact that I'm really, really good, as opposed to relying on Jesus. And it's foolish, right?
Yeah.
And it's the work of the enemy that is seeking to lead us away from just full trust and reliance, that to say, look at Jesus and say, he's enough. He makes me right before God. And now that I'm right before God, now I'm free to go and serve him without fear.
Yeah, I love that. As we head into that second portion from your sermon where we talk about the curse of the ruler, you have this example here from Francis Schaeffer where he talks about the invisible tape recorder. Some people might be familiar with it, but if you want to just give us sort of broad scope what he sort of lays out, and then we could talk about it here.
Yeah, so Francis Schaeffer is a pretty well-known Christian philosopher and theologian from the 20th century. And I like what he does here. So this is what I'm going to share is kind of a paraphrase But basically what Schaeffer posits, in particular, like in terms of talking about this sort of like universal reality of our failure to adhere to the law. Schaeffer posits this for, to the person who's like, and I addressed this a little bit in the sermon, to the person who's like, well, like, I don't believe in, religious law, right? Like, I don't believe, like, I think it's silly or absurd that, a book that's thousands of years old should set the moral standard for human beings, today, right? Schaeffer's the example that he gives is really kind of aimed toward that kind of mindset. And what he suggests is, he says, imagine that every single person is wearing an invisible tape recorder, right? That you walk around and that invisible tape recorder, it's catching everything you said, every promise you've made, every standard that you've set for yourself and for others. And what Schaeffer basically says, he says, on Judgment Day, when we appear before God, and people are going to be like, you know what, like, I didn't know you existed. I didn't believe you existed. And you can't hold me responsible for a law I didn't believe in, or a law maybe that I was unaware of. Right.
Sure.
And basically, like the note, it's addressing this notion that like we could be held responsible for a law that we didn't know of. And basically saying like, hey, God, like, how are you going to hold me responsible for this? Like, is God really going to judge me like in, for something that I was perhaps ignorant of, right? Sure. Not just like sort of hard-heartedly rebellious of. And what Schaeffer says is what God is basically going to say. He's going to respond to saying, because God is fair, right? That he's not just going to judge us by the law of Scripture, right? That he set, even though like we do believe that's a universal moral standard, but that God is ultimately going to judge us by our own words and our own standards. And so we imagine, right, this tape recorder, right? It's capturing every standard we've set. It's captured our own words, the expectations that we have of ourselves and our others. And God is going to play back for us there. And there we are going to be judged based on every time we have failed to meet our own standard. Every time we've said to someone, you ought to do this, you should do this. The tape recorder, it's recorded only the standards that you have set for people around you. And that God, Schaeffer's positing, and again, this is a sort of a hypothetical, right, kind of idea. He's positing that God is going to simply judge us by the standards that we have set, the ways that we have judged people, right? That, and this actually in some ways is consistent, right? With the measure that you measure others, it's going to be measured to you, right? And this is what Schaeffer's playing with. And it's basically the argument that he's trying to make is that like, even if we're not judged by the laws of Scripture, right? Even if we're not judged by, the moral standard that God has revealed in the Bible, even if we are judged by our own standards, none of us even meet the standard that we set for ourselves, right? We all fall short of that standard, right?
Nobody's perfect.
Right? No, nobody's perfect, right? You got it, right? Right. And that's the same thing, right? Like that John Stott says, right? Like regardless of the standard, right? What seems to be universal is none of us seem to be able to meet the standard perfectly. Whatever that standard is, whether it's God's standard or ours, we all seem to fail when it comes to meeting that perfection, right? And that's, I think, what Paul is getting at when he talks about the reality of that to live, the one who adheres to the law for their righteousness lives under a curse, right? Because what that law is, whatever the law is, whatever standard we're trying to follow, it always demands that we do more. It always demands that we fulfill it. There's never a time when fulfillment of our standards, again, whether the law of Scripture or the law of Marcus or the law of Matt, whatever that law is, it always demands that there's more to be done, right? And as soon as, right, like maybe I got a perfect day, right? Let's imagine I got a perfect day. Guess what's waiting there for me tomorrow? And the next day, and the next day, and the next day, right? Is that demand of perfection, right? It never rests. And that's the sort of existential experience of living under this curse where there's constant standards being set for us, this constant need to measure what we've done and say, is it enough? And even if it was enough for one day, is it going to be enough the next day and the next day and the next day, right? That's the experience of the curse that Paul is really driving at. And I like the way that Schaeffer's invisible tape recorder of like, hey, what if we weren't even measured by God's standard, but just our own standard that had been captured? Yeah. We still wouldn't meet it, right? Absolutely. We still wouldn't meet it, right? And that's the reality of the curse of being judged on measuring what I've done.
Yeah, I like how he sort of lays that out, where even if we think there is no moral standard or anything, we still have like our own opinions and things that we're shaping, and like that he's saying like you ought to or you should or whatever. Like we're still forming some sort of moral standards that are impossible to live up to.
Yeah. So. And I will say, like, one of the things that I find like Schaeffer's, this scenario that he posits to be really helpful is it helps engage, in a more morally relative culture, because, I think a lot of times the move, when we face moral relativism is trying to establish, that there are moral absolutes and there at least seem to be some things that are consistent morally throughout time and culture, which I think there's an argument to be made for that. But again, I think someone can easily respond like, well, yeah, but even the way we understand some of those things have shifted and changed over time. And so which standard is the right one? And what Schaeffer's scenario allows us to do is say, let's just for a moment, let's just assume moral relativism. Yeah. Right. Like let's just say, okay, let's assume the moral relativist is correct, right? Standards have shifted, standards have changed over time. Who really knows, right? What if there's a real objective standard, who really knows? Like let's grant that for a moment. And it actually still demonstrates that even in a morally relative universe, what does remain consistent, what isn't relative, is our failure to meet whatever moral standard we live by, right? Yeah. And so it does, I think, it reflects this reality of it, just the reality of human creatures continuing to fall short is just this sort of inescapable reality from history. That even if the standard is relative, what remains universal is human beings' inability to perfectly adhere to the standards that we set. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. That's pretty heavy stuff talking about the curse. So let's move into the freedom from the ruler here. Galatians 3:11 through 14. And you have a quote from Augustine here, which I'll go ahead and read and let you talk about here. But he says, "The law leads to knowledge of sin, and at length to the transgression of the law itself. It is thus with the knowledge and increase of sin that grace may be sought through faith."
Yeah. Yeah. So what Augustine's getting at here, and again, no surprise that this is coming from Augustine, who would go on to influence Luther and becomes incredibly important in his thought for how we talk about sin and grace and justification. And so what Augustine's saying, here, and this is, again, just echoes, this is drawing directly on the thought of Paul in both Romans and Galatians, that what the law does is the law enters in and it grants clarity to that reality of the curse. Yeah. Right. Is that, like, again, we've kind of unpacked that, it's like, regardless of the standard, regardless of, the times, regardless of the culture, it seems like it's universal that human beings fall short of the standard, right? And what the law does is the law enters in and it really reveals, kind of like it illuminates that reality, right? Yeah. It's like, hey, maybe everyone has this sense that something's amiss. The law enters in and is like, it smacks you in the face, right? It's like, oh, things might actually be worse than I thought, right? It might be a little bit worse off than just a Po Buddies Nerfect kind of situation, right? And so it enters in not to say, all right, here's the standard you need to meet, right? Right? Like this is, here's the measure, like meet that demand. It enters in to reveal that reality so that that knowledge of sin would increase and that we might seek after grace, right? That the law really reveals humanity's need for rescue.
Yeah. There's no purpose of grace or the gospel without the law. Like,
right.
It'd just be pointless.
Right. Yeah. If the notion of like human perfection were possible, right? Like why the cross, right? And so the law really reveals humanity's need for the cross, right? The need for someone to rescue us from ourselves and to rescue us from the power of evil, to rescue us from the reality of just judgment, right? That the law reveals that reality and that need, so that we might begin to see that God has, right, because he's so gracious, because he's so merciful, has already stepped in to meet that need in and through Jesus.
Yeah. So we're going to transition now from the ruler to the ID badge, or the why of work, which was that optional chapter, which wasn't required, but I mean, we're going to dig a little bit here. So digging into that drawer, pulling it out. I did like this chapter a lot, where he talked a lot about, I mean, Luther talks about vocation. You could see how he was sort of weaving that in, how just whatever our role in life is, whether it be at work or within family or whatever it is, like we're doing it for God, and it's God calling us, like vocation, into that role. But I don't know. I think it resonated with me, especially just coming from a role technically outside of the church into a role within the church. It's just sort of seeing sort of both sides, where I can be like, I don't know, my old job. Yes, I worked at like a Lutheran school at Concordia and everything, but it technically wasn't directly tied to the gospel necessarily. Like what I was doing, like there were days where I was like, what am I doing? Like this is sort of like, I enjoy it, but like it's sort of useless in the end. Like I'm not making a change within the world. I'm literally just keeping stats for this game or streaming a game so somebody can watch it. Like, so I think there were times where I was like, what's the point? But then I liked where he did is tying it back in with love and sort of purpose there, and how everything we do has a purpose and it's bringing love to others. And I don't know, just thinking about how, I don't know, just going back to my examples, like what I was doing was making it possible for grandparents who lived in different nations or different states across the world were able to watch their grandkids play sports, or were able to be exposed to things within Concordia. So I think seeing it from that side, and now where I work now here at ULC, like a little more directly working a little bit more within the church world and everything, but just to see how God can use you no matter where you are in life or whatever you're doing, as a way to extend his love to others. And I don't know if that was something you wanted to talk about.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think that Matt does really well in this chapter is number one, is I think he speaks to, I think, two of the most common experiences that people have around their work. And I think they're kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum, right? One is the sort of like rise and grind, like workaholic mentality that can be really common in our world, where it's like we find all of our meaning in our work, right? Like that's the source of our success, right? And so whether we're putting it on the scale and we're weighing, right? Look at all the great stuff that I've done,
right?
Or we're holding it up to the ruler and saying, man, look at all the employees of the month plaques that I've stacked up, right? However we're doing it, right? It's that temptation to find all of our meaning in our work, right? That's one, right? The other one is maybe a little bit more of what you described, is that maybe just that experience of a sense of meaningless in our work, right? Which can very easily lead to, that like, got a case of the Mondays for all of our Office Space fans, to you wake up and it's just like you dread going into the office another day. You dread having to punch in again. Right. And it's just like that, like, here we go again. Right. And both of those are like pretty exhausting ways to live.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, well, like, what's the alternative? And I think, like, I appreciated like the example that you had of like being able to like rethink it, because like what he posits here, and I think he's right, is that the alternative to either looking for meaning in our work or seeing our work as entirely meaningless, right? The alternative is to approach our work with love, right? And it sounds really, really simple, right? It almost sounds like too simple, right? But I actually think like that subtle shift kind of changes everything. So I want to read because I just think this captures it really well. So this is from page 67 on Junk Drawer Jesus.
6-7.
There you go.
Kids
That's
out
right. But page 67, Matt says this. He says, the meaning of life and the point and purpose of all labor is love. But notice, it's not love of self. First, it's love for God. Second, it's love for your neighbor. We can't correctly understand the rest of God's revelation unless we first wrap our warped hearts around this truth. Love is the why of your work. It doesn't matter what you do. If you're launching the next great tech startup, it's supposed to be about love. If you're a stay-at-home dad, you fold the laundry and make lunches out of love. If you're a pilot, you land the plane safely out of love. If you're a member of Congress, you're sent there to legislate with love. If you're the guy who shows up at my house 4 times a year to spray for bugs, it's an act of love. It's not so loving to the cockroaches we're trying to keep out of our hallway bathroom, but my daughter sure does appreciate it. Like so many other things in this world that God has designed, we get work right when we realize that although we're involved in it, we are not the ones being served by it. It doesn't exist to prop up our self-worth or earn us acceptance. Our labor is about loving others, right? And I just think that's just like just such a simple but really powerful truth that he's unpacking, right? Yeah. Because like as you expressed, like that subtle shift of being able to see, okay, here's what I'm doing, right? When I was live streaming a game, working at Concordia, like on the one hand, like it can seem kind of useless. On the other hand, it's like, yeah, there might be a grandparent who, maybe because of health reasons or, just, because of cost, right? Or whatever, is never going to be able to travel to see their grandson or their granddaughter compete in college athletics. And by live streaming that, like you're giving them access, right, to see and find joy in watching their family like compete and do something they love, right? You facilitating that, right, and being able to approach that with that sense of love for that person, for that athlete and their family, right? Like that's a powerful shift, right? Yeah. And I think the same is true, right? No matter how, now working in a church, right? Like, I think a lot of people might look at that and be like, well, that's a really noble thing. But like, that struggle with like meaningless can exist there too. Sure. Or that struggle to just be like, I'm important because, right? Yep. I work here, I do this, right? Finding that worth, finding that value in our work, right? Like that's dangerous too, right? But to be able to say, like, whether it's ministry, right, as a pastor, as a director of communications and production, as a doctor, as a nurse, as a lawyer, as whatever, right? When all of that stuff is oriented in love for other people and a desire to honor and glorify God in what we do, then we begin to get work right. Yeah. And I think that has the power to profoundly change how we see the day-to-day of our lives.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you want to talk about it a whole lot here, but I mean, it's no secret to the people probably watching or listening, but with your announcement of you sort of changing your vocation in the near future, I just want to say I'm excited for you, and just I know that you're going to be taking that love of God and sharing it with others, and I'm excited how you're going to be personally putting that out into the world.
Yeah, so. Thank you. And I mean, it's I do think like much of that desire has been born out of, I hope, on my best days. Yeah. Certainly there's maybe, days of ego and saying like, oh, I'll feel really important, or people will, be like impressed, or, but like, I think on my best days, it's born out of a love for God and a love for other people, and just resonating with that theme of Jesus as our advocate with the Father, right? Yeah. And being able to say like, by going and serving as a lawyer and becoming an advocate for others, there's an opportunity to reflect the character of Jesus in that. And that's something that brings a lot of joy and delight. And it's something that I hope everyone, can find, regardless of what they do. Absolutely. Is that opportunity to love others, to reflect the character of Jesus in their work. And hopefully be able to find a sense of purpose in that.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And I really enjoyed this chapter, and just how, I don't know, it's very relevant. All of us have some form of vocation that we're living into.
For
and
sure.
I liked his example of the friend from his church back at home, where he was talking about him cutting off the thorns of the roses, and then that's ultimately like what he gave to his future wife and everything. Yeah. And just how like someone that he didn't even think would have a vocation like that, and how like everyone has a role to play. God has a calling for them, and how it can lead to the greater good of God's love. So yeah. I just think it's really beautiful.
Yeah. And I think it's a good reminder, like I think everyone goes through points of like, what am I doing? I don't like what I'm doing. Do I need a change? And like, yeah, obviously like in those moments, like we should be like, leaning into prayer and discernment and looking to, trusted and wise voices to help kind of guide us in that. But I would hope that the place where we can find some comfort and some solace when we're feeling a sense of dis-ease or restlessness around our work is to say, loving God and loving other people isn't something that I have to wait for some other time to do, right? I think about this with our college students, right? College is just by nature a very future-oriented time, right? Sure. You're thinking about what's next. You're thinking about what I'm being prepared for, right? Which is great and is good, right? But our meaning doesn't start when our career starts, right? And our purpose doesn't start when our career starts, right? That even right now in the grind of the academic year, right? You can still love God and love other people, and you can use where you are, right? That's something everyone always, all the time has the opportunity to do. And we just, I think a lot of times need that reminder to attune our eyes and our hearts toward that.
Absolutely. Well, that's probably it for this segment of Digging Deeper. We'll have Amy and Nate coming on the other side of this. But looking ahead to next week, it's going to be sort of similar to this week, where Pastor Gabe will be preaching on pietists and party animals, which is a fun title already. So excited to look into that one. But there's also the optional chapter of how God speaks, and I'm sure Pastor Gabe and I will be talking about that here on Digging Deeper, but won't be necessarily covered in the sermon. So Pastor Gabe will be preaching on another Galatians chapter here, Galatians 5, verses 1 through 15. So if you want a jump start there, head to that chapter on pietists and party animals and Galatians 5. So thanks again for tuning in to Digging Deeper. Make sure to stay around for Amy and Nate.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. We're grateful to be back today. Had the chance to just really be blessed by the sermon this week, where we were talking about the ruler and thinking about that for ourselves. It was it kind of brought to mind the psalm that Nate wrote this song about, Psalm 139. You want to read it?
Yeah, let's do it. So we're going to read Psalm 139, starting at verse 8. If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Yeah, and I guess with the measuring up and the idea of the ruler, it was just the idea that even at our darkest, even with that where sin, with like the prodigal son, where the worst that we can go, God's love isn't held in the balance there. I mean, Jesus has secured that, and we might go through tough times, and leaning to God in faith is makes it easier if we follow the way that He showed us to live our life. But that no matter where we go, God, He'll be there.
And I think we were talking about this too, about how He's actually running after us. That we were, I don't know, I've just been thinking about some of the decisions that I've made in my life that were, choices of mine to live my life not following the Lord. And just realizing some of the consequences that came out of it. And just have been thinking about that a lot about, I don't think God was punishing me for them. The reality was He was just letting the consequences happen. Yeah. And the truth was He was continually calling me back, continually running after me. And so I think sometimes we think God is far away when we're going through trials, but the reality is He's actually running to us all the time.
Yeah, or we think we're being punished because we're experiencing consequences for, like God said, don't murder, and then it's like, why is my life so bad? It's like, well, you are murdered, and it's just that we think that is punishment a lot of times, and He's our champion.
So cool. And this song is so great. I love it.
Yeah, it's mostly. I was trying to write something very scripture almost entirely all the way. So this is, you'll hear a lot of that psalm in here.
Sweet. Cool.
You knit me in the womb. Tenderly your spirit moved, guiding every thread of me into a tapestry. Even now I feel your hand orchestrating like a band, past, present, and future for your will and glory, Lord. Where can I go from your spirit, my Lord? In the heights of heaven, in the depths of the earth, if the sun lost its light and each day was as night, I know you will find me there. You will find me there. You will find me there. You will find me there.
Such a great song. Thanks. Hi, everybody.
Thanks, Amy and Nate, for talking about just your experiences and talking about how the ruler can be applied to our lives, and just how you see that, like, God's just chasing after us. It makes me think of the parable of the Good Shepherd, where he leaves the 99 to find the one. I think that fit really well there. And loved hearing about your new song as well, Nate. You'll Find Me There, talking about, I think it was Psalm 139. Loved seeing how that fit in as well. But yeah, that's all we have for this week's episode of Digging Deeper. Coming up ahead next week, like I said, will be The Whistle. It's on the chapter on pietist and pure party animals, and optional chapter on how God speaks before that one. Gabe will be preaching on Galatians 5, 1 through 15. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. God bless.